Our topic tonight, again, is going to be the religious leaders during Jesus' day, the Scribes and the Pharisees. We're looking at the Pharisees now, and we'll be bringing the Scribes back into the picture to discuss them tonight. I hope we understand a little of the distinction between the two, and we're going to make that even clearer this evening, because we do have a wealth of material given to us in the four Gospels, how Jesus dealt with these particular men. He never approached them to begin with as if they were a group of people who were beyond the ability to see the truth. Some of them came to that place later in their life and later in Jesus' ministry, and it didn't take that long. We read in Matthew chapter 12 that the Pharisees, unlike maybe some others who heard the things he had to say, knew full well that his claims were right and justified. And he had demonstrated the validity of his claims, and he had proven them time and time again. And the Pharisees then, of course, chose to level the charge against him. The things that you do, we don't deny that you do them, but you do them by the power of the prince of the demons, Beelzebul, who dwells in you. And Jesus said, well, that, my friends, is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit that never has forgiveness. Not in this life, not in the next life. It never, ever, never, ever has forgiveness. All the Pharisees weren't like that, but a large number of them were. And I guess I'm just reminded of a passage over in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 24 as we kind of approach our subject tonight. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 24, where the Apostle Paul says that the slave of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, forbearing, literally, as you have in the margin, in meekness instructing those who oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. So we have to mix together not only some of the things that we find here in the Gospels, we certainly have in historical precedent and practice what Jesus' response was to the religious leaders of his day. We have to mix that with some of the Apostle Paul's teaching, that we must be gentle and not strive in anger and bitterness with other people. But then we can turn that around also and say that we must take what the Apostle Paul and the other apostles had to say in some of the epistles and remind ourselves of the practice of that in Jesus' life and ministry. We've often been accused of being a contrary-wise group, but I hope, and this should be our desire, I hope at the last day, which will be the day Paul writes of in Romans 2 and verse 16, when God will judge even the secrets of men's hearts by his gospel, that God will see that our hearts have been right and that we've only wanted to remain pure and do what his will is and follow what his practice is, which is not to agree with error or heresy, not to tolerate it, but to stay with the truth. So over in the Gospels, we're going to be looking over in them. We're going to come tonight to the second of three statements I wanted to make concerning the Pharisees. I said if we gathered the information together from those earlier sources, one of those being the New Testament that we've mentioned before, then about three basic statements could be made concerning them, so that when you've said those three, you've said all you really need to say about them. Or when you know those three, you know all you really need to know. The first of those concerned the fact that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were opposites. They were on the opposite end of the political question. They were on the opposite end of especially the religious question. They were opposites. So that was the Pharisees versus the Sadducees. Tonight we come to a second point, and that is the following. The Pharisees and the Scribes are distinct groups in the New Testament, but they're not hostile toward one another. The Pharisees and the Scribes are distinct groups in the New Testament, but they are not hostile toward one another. So you have to remember that the Pharisees and Sadducees are in two different ballparks entirely. politically and religiously and socially in every way. And they are opposed to one another. You often see the terminology, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The New Testament doesn't mean to imply that they didn't have their differences. But as we said, those few places in Matthew, chapters 3 and 16, where one article governs both nouns, it can be easily explained by the little maxim that a common enemy unites two foes. The Pharisees and the Scribes, our subject tonight, are not enemies or foes with one another, but they are not the same. They are not identical. They will be seen in the New Testament to be two distinct groups. Now that's something I think I've said before, but now I hope I can say a little more and it'll make a little more sense to you. The term Pharisee appears about 100 times in the New Testament, from Matthew through Acts, plus over in the book of Philippians. Those are the places where that term is restricted. Matthew through Acts, plus over in the book of Philippians. And only about 10 of those are in the singular, meaning a Pharisee. The vast majority of them, 90% of them, are in the plural, a group, the Pharisees. Only about 10 of those occurrences are in the singular, and all but 2 of those are in Luke's writings. So Luke is the one who mentions the term Pharisee in the singular most often. Now, of those 100 occurrences, the Pharisees are separated from the Scribes in at least 21 places. You'll see something about the Pharisees and it'll be scribe, or it'll be scribe under some other designation, in about 21 places in the following formulae. Now, I'm going to give you the different formulae that you find in the New Testament that makes a distinction between the Pharisees and the Scribes. So we're talking about this second point, a second broad statement that can be made about them, that the Pharisees and Scribes are distinct groups in the New Testament, but they're not opposites or hostile. The first of those formulae is found over in Luke 7 and verse 30, where Luke makes reference to the Pharisees and lawyers. Now remember, if we've got 2 nouns and they're joined together here, it's as though he's speaking of 2 different groups, so they wouldn't be the same. So we don't want to confuse them. However, they're going to be very similar, and there are going to be some carryovers between the 2 groups, like we will not have seen earlier with the Pharisees and Sadducees. So this is a very important point of distinction that we have to bear in mind. This account in Luke 7 has Jesus referring to the baptism of John and how most of the people, the common people, received him gladly, and they showed God's claims against them to be right in that they justified him, or they justified him in that they showed his claims against him to be right, and they showed that was their attitude by being baptized of John. But in verse 30 we read, the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against themselves, being not baptized of him. Wow. The Pharisees and the lawyers. We're going to be understanding more and more who these people are. The Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's counsel against them, or God's witness against them. And that witness, of course, was John the Baptist's message. And what was that? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And what is repent? Well, it would seem to imply that, and he wasn't talking to one group of people, he went everywhere talking to everyone. You must all repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That would imply that the Pharisees and lawyers had something to repent of, and that's something they refused to accept, and they refused to believe that. Theirs was a justification by their own traditions, by their own interpretations, by their own works, by their own abilities. So they have, as a result, rejected God's counsel against them. You say, I thought we were talking about Pharisees and Scribes. Here it says lawyers. Well, remember, lawyer is another term for scribe in the New Testament. We've seen that earlier. And that name lawyer, the nomikos, underscores the fact that they were experts in legal matters. Scribe would underscore one thing, we've got this on earlier tapes, but lawyer, nomikos, would underscore the fact that they were experts in legal matters. Now, I can't help but just assume that they felt they had John on a point or two. I mean, John, let's face it, he didn't have training. Unless you call training with Gila monsters in the desert biblical training. He didn't have training. Remember, he was in the deserts until his showing unto Israel. What's that, the last verse in Luke 1, I think? He was in the desert until his showing unto Israel. I mean, his mother and father gave him up. I mean, he was a miracle child, so he wasn't theirs to begin with, I suppose. And they knew that his birth as well as his life was going to be extraordinary. And they gave him up, and he spent his time in the desert. What? Well, we're not told. We find him going into the desert. The next reference we have to him, we find him coming out of the desert. And I can't help but think that these lawyers think that they have the prophet John on a point or two. What I mean by that is they think they have him on some Old Testament interpretation, misinterpretation, let's say. John, somehow the heat has done something to his brain. Remember, they called Paul, they said, thou art mad, much learning doth make thee mad. So I guess it was some other cause that made John mad. And really, it's us making people mad. It's mad in a different way, though. They mean mad crazy. We mean mad, like angry, because they don't like to hear the word or the truth. And so if we say they're mad, it's easier for them to say that we're mad. But they mean by mad crazy. Well, you know, it's rather difficult. John is in a very unusual and difficult situation. How can he even justify himself? I mean, they're rejecting the counsel. They've got some reason to. I mean, it's not a justified reason, but they have some reason to. And surely they can look at him and think, we're not going to believe somebody that's just come in out of the sun. I mean, the thought of having to lower yourself. You have been trained all your life. You are a lawyer. That's why I find it interesting that Luke uses not the term scribe, which would mean something else here, but he uses the term lawyer. They were experts. And John is quoting some passages from the Old Testament, like in Isaiah chapter 40, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the Lord's ways. And he's applying that to himself. That's rather presumptuous. To quote Scripture and say, I, and you're a human being, I am the fulfillment of that. So I'm sure they thought they had him somewhere. But for whatever the reason, whatever those places were where they thought they had him, they rejected his baptism. And Luke interprets that by saying, in rejecting John, you're rejecting the one that sent John. That's right. That's the whole connection that's being made here. The people, in that they were baptized with John's baptism, verse 29, showed that they received the one that had sent John. They received God's testimony against them, and so they, in that sense, justified God. That's not justified in the sense of made righteous, but just showed that God's claims against them were righteous and just and manifested his justice. Verse 30, of course, you'll have the opposite. They rejected John's baptism. Of course, Luke says it the other way. I'm just turning it around. They rejected John's baptism, and what they've shown through that is they have rejected the one that sent the prophet John. So there's one of the several formulae where we see that scribes and Pharisees are two distinct groups. Here they're called lawyers and Pharisees. Then we have another of the formulae, number 2 we would be on, or B, I suppose. If we're under our second point, then we'd be on B, Pharisees and doctors. This is in the same gospel, Luke chapter 5 and verse 17. Pharisees and doctors. Literally, teachers. Literally, it would be teachers. They're called doctors of the law. Pharisees and doctors, literally teachers of the law. Nomi didaskalos, I think was the earlier term. And it came to pass on a certain day as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law, or teachers of the law, sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was present for him to heal. Now, we've looked at this verse before. Probably what we have is what I have called a fact-finding mission. A fact-finding mission. I call it that so we don't misinterpret any of these places, whether it's Matthew 3 or Luke 7 or Luke 5, and we have Jesus or someone else such as the prophet John, and around him is gathered some of these religious leaders, lest we misinterpret that thinking they've come with a receptive heart or open ears or open eyes. That is not how they are coming, and I don't think that's the reason behind them coming. I think as long as we are a little grounded in what's going on in Judaism in the religious sphere of this day, we would understand these as being fact-finding missions which have been sent out. Observers from the religious establishment, which is the Sanhedrin, testing the orthodoxy of these new, well, one, a claimed Messiah, Jesus Christ. The other, people were saying he was the Messiah. Remember over in John 1, that's the first question they asked him, are you Messiah? And he said no. He confessed and denied not, he confessed and denied not, right, I am not the Messiah. I am not the Christ. A fact-finding mission, testing their orthodoxy. Tremendous claims are being made about these two men, Jesus and John the Baptist, and of course tremendous claims are being made by them as well. Verse 21 here in this chapter proves that those nomi didaskalos, the doctors or teachers of the law, were in fact the scribes. Because as we read on in this story, behold, men brought in a man in a bed, a man which was taken with palsy, and they sought means to bring him in and to lay him before him. And when they could not find by what way they might bring him in because of the multitude, they went up on the housetop and let him down through the tiling with his couch into the midst before Jesus. When he saw their faith, he said unto him, Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. And the scribes and the Pharisees, double articles also, by the way, the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this which speaketh blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? So I think that he's identifying who those teachers of the law were earlier. They are the scribes in verse 21. But what we're looking at this passage for is to prove that the Pharisees and the scribes are, again, two distinct groups. Then letter C, a third formulae, the scribes of the Pharisees. Now this is the most unusual. This is the most unusual formula that appears in the New Testament, relating or describing the two. The scribes of the Pharisees. That means the scribes that belonged to the Pharisees, or the Pharisees' scribes. The Pharisees' scribes. Now it appears in different Greek constructions, but it appears 3 times in the New Testament, and I'm not for sure that your translation's going to bear it out every time. First of all, if you start over in Mark chapter 2, Mark chapter 2, back up in verse 14. The scribes of the Pharisees, or the Pharisees, that's apostrophe S, the Pharisees' scribes. In verse 14, we've got, he passed by and saw Levi and said, Follow me. And it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in his house, many tax collectors and sinners sat also together with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes, literally how the Greek reads, is when the scribes of the Pharisees saw him eat with tax collectors. The and, the chi, the and is an inferior reading. And don't worry about it if you're concerned about changing anything. We've got a place over in Acts where it's very definite. You don't have to change anything because there the King James followed the right text. Well, there was only one text there. You've got 2 possibilities here. But it can be proven in other places of the New Testament, over in Acts 23, as we'll see here in a moment, that the Pharisees had their scribes, or that there were scribes who were a part of the Pharisaic party, and as a result they weren't referred to as scribes and Pharisees in a verse like this, but the scribes of the Pharisees. So when the scribes of the Pharisees saw him eat with tax collectors and sinners, then they questioned his disciples. Then over in Luke chapter 5, we looked at Luke 7:30. Now we'll look at Luke 5:30. And we looked at Luke 5:17. So we're back in chapter 5, back on the 30th verse. Now this is a poor translation. They realized, the translators of the King James Bible, that something was up. Notice this pronoun there in here. But their scribes and Pharisees murmured against his disciples. Well, that should alert us right away. Most of the time you're going to find the Sadducees, the scribes, the Pharisees. Now you've got this pronoun, their scribes and Pharisees. Well, here's really what the Greek should read, but the Pharisees and their scribes. That's maybe the easiest way if you want to write that in for your Bible, but the Pharisees and their scribes murmured against his disciples. In other words, between the word but and the word there, you have to insert 3 words. You can do it with a carrot stick. The Pharisees and. But the Pharisees and their scribes murmured against his disciples, saying, "Why do ye eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" All right, did you all get that? Because I always get questions. Well, now, did we change it, or where was that changed, or what was it changed to? Or, well, I tried to change it, and I wrote it in between the wrong words, and I'd already scratched out something, and then I marked something else out. Now, I just gave up on it after a while. I never got it between the verses, and I went to testify to someone about this verse, and I was speaking German by the time I got through reading it. So make sure you get that now. But the Pharisees and their scribes. See, they knew that something was up, or they wouldn't have given us this word there. Their scribes, in other words, scribes belong to someone. Someone owns some scribes here. The scribes are part of someone's a person or group or community. They're scribes. And what's going to become important here in a moment. And then finally, there's the third place, and these are only 3 that I know of. And only one of these really comes through in the King James translation, but the third one is over in Acts 23 and verse 9. Acts 23 and verse 9. Paul has caused this dissension, this commotion in the council by making reference to his Pharisaic background. The Sadducees are upset over that. Verse 9, "And there arose a great cry, and the scribes and the Pharisees," no, the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part. Now that's an unusual phrase. That's an unusual way of stating whatever you want to state about scribes and or Pharisees. It's not just a standard scribes and Pharisees, or scribes or Sadducees and Pharisees, or the scribes and Sadducees, or Pharisees and lawyers. This is unique. The scribes that were of the Pharisees' part. The scribes. Well, now wait a minute. I thought we went back up into verse 6 when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other scribes. No, the distinction up there is Sadducees and Pharisees. When Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, then he cried, "I am a Pharisee." Not "I am a scribe." But look, we get to verse 9, and we're told that the Pharisees and the Sadducees have this great dissension in verse 7. The Sadducees don't believe certain things, verse 8, but the Pharisees do believe them. It's always Sadducees, Pharisees, Pharisees, Sadducees. Verse 9, "There arose a great cry in the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part." So, I think that what is generally understood by people, now this may not be true of everyone here, and I'm talking about you before you learn any better, if you have learned any better in some of these teachings, I think that the general way this is understood is to see the Pharisees as the leaders, and the scribes as their followers, like perhaps their secretaries. I think that was probably my misinterpretation or misunderstanding at one time. It may not have been yours, but I think that's probably the general misunderstanding, that you somehow think of the Pharisees as being above the scribes. The Pharisees were above, and the scribes were like their followers, or their disciples, or their copyists, or their recorders, or their secretaries. Well, that's wholly wrong. That's wholly wrong. Just the reverse of that is true. What we have is the fact that the scribes are the leaders, and the Pharisees are their followers. The Pharisees do have some followers. That idea of someone following the Pharisees better fits the several places where the, quote, disciples, unquote, of the Pharisees are seen, and not where any reference is made to the scribes. For instance, if you go back over into Mark chapter 2 again, in verse 18. Mark 2 and verse 18. Maybe I can be kind of diagramming this for you so you won't be confused. The scribes will come on the top then. The Pharisees come next. I think it's probably generally misunderstood by people as the reverse, that the Pharisees are on the top, they are somehow the leaders because they appear so many times in the New Testament. And the scribes were like their copyists or their followers, but that's not true. If we're going to speak of any followers of the Pharisees, it would be their disciples. There are a few references made to them, like in Mark 2:18, and the disciples of John. The what? The disciples of John and of the Pharisees. Now, the disciples of the Pharisees do not equal the scribes. The disciples of the scribes equal the Pharisees. Who are the disciples of the Pharisees? Well, I don't know that it's really a technical term, but it's just some part of the population in Israel that was very prone to follow the Pharisees, follow their religious interpretations without actually being a part of them. And then over in Luke 5:33, Luke 5:33, the same account. And you have the reference to the Pharisees' disciples again. It's italicized in the KJV, but the first time disciples appears, it's not. Disciples of John, then it would be implied, and those of the Pharisees. So the italics would simply be a necessary help in supplying what's absent. It'd be correct, in other words. And they said unto him, Why did the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise of the disciples of, not just of, the disciples of the Pharisees. So who those were, I haven't been able to discover any particular people. It's probably just kind of like a common statement, a general, broad statement like the one made of John. Who were John's disciples? Well, just people that agreed with him, people that followed his message. We read over in Matthew chapter 11 that when John was in prison, he sent some of his disciples to Jesus. We read later in Luke's gospel, whenever John was killed, his disciples went and took his body. Remember, he was beheaded. His disciples went and took his body and buried him. Well, just people that followed him and his message and that were close to him. So I think that's probably all we can make of this phrase, the disciples of the Pharisees. And then the fourth of the four formulae is just a standard one, scribes and Pharisees, or the reverse, Pharisees and scribes. That's the typical formula seen in the Gospels. Pharisees and lawyers, the first one I gave you, just seen once. Pharisees and doctors, just seen once. Scribes of the Pharisees, that would show we're talking about two different groups. Scribes of the Pharisees, 3 times. Then fourthly, the scribes and the Pharisees, or the Pharisees and the scribes. That is the typical formula in the Gospels, almost exclusively in Matthew and Luke. I'm just going to give you those places real quickly, and we won't look all of them up. Matthew, we'll start there. Matthew's Gospel, 5:20, 12:38, 15:1. Then all these verses are in chapter 23. 2, 13, 15, 23, 25, 27, 29. Then over in Mark, chapter 7, verses 1 and 5. Then in Luke, 5:21, 6, 7. The next thing you have in the KJV is 11:44, but that is a no, as we'll see here in a moment. 14:3 and 15:2. Just on one occasion in Mark, chapter 7. 2 verses, but just one episode, and none over in John. All right, so who were the scribes? The scribes were the ordained scholars, the theologians of their day, and the Pharisees were like their disciples, their students. In other words, if the Pharisees need to look up to anyone or look into anything, they do it via the person or the interpretation of the scribe. I think I've said it this way before: the scribes made the law and the Pharisees did their best to keep it. So much so, Jesus castigates them for their hypocrisy. But the groups are definitely distinct. The scribes had formal training. The Pharisees are lay members. No formal training, no schooling, no religious indoctrination, nothing of that order. The scribes are the ones who had the formal academic training and who went through a formal period of probation and who went through a very formal ordination. Yes.
Did the scribes try to keep the laws like the Pharisees did too? Or?
Oh yeah, they tried to keep them too. But the thing with the scribes is they were smarter than the Pharisees, so they had more ways out of it. You know, we hear about the Pharisees trying to get out of the laws, but if we turn over to Matthew 23, we always see scribes and Pharisees together. The scribes were the ones who made them, so the scribes were best the ones to break them. Probably you really see the scribes trying to get out of the laws more than the Pharisees. The Pharisees were zealots. I mean, they were really zealots to keeping the law as the scribes would lay it down. You know, I've said before, the converts are often worse members of whatever than the founder, than the leader. And then you've got the scribes and you've got the Pharisees, then you've got those proselytes that the Pharisees make over in Matthew 23. That would just be someone you wouldn't want to tangle with. Someone who's gone through that many steps and that indoctrinated.
For the continuation of this message,
someone who's gone through that many steps and that indoctrinated. But, yeah, the scribes, they were the ones to make the laws, so they were the ones who had the mental ability to find ways to skirt their own laws that they had made. We'll look at some of those later. They're ridiculous. About plucking out gray hairs and not eating eggs that were laid on holy days and things like that, as though the chicken knew what day it was when it laid an egg. There are a couple of passages I want to deal with right now. If you turn over to Luke chapter 11, and I want to say what some scholars say, and I don't know that it's necessarily true or can be proven, but there are two passages in the Bible. One is Luke 11, and the other is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's account, where some scholars think that we've got two particular portions of Scripture that are specifically set up in such a way to prove the fact that there's a difference between the scribes and the Pharisees. I've already given you a lot of ways, just with the four formulae. Those are ways you can prove that they are distinct, that they're different. Those are two different groups. But some scholars say that there are two passages that are specifically intended. Well, they were written for this purpose, to demonstrate the difference, or to demonstrate the fact that there was a difference between these two groups. The first of these is Luke 11, 37 through 54. And they outline that section like this. In verses 30, well, we can skip over those first couple of verses that are just introduction. In verses 39 through 44, Jesus, in the first place, castigates the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. And then in verses 46 through 52, that gives us all the red writing, leaves out the black, which is the introduction, the midway point, and the conclusion. Midway point being a transition from one group to another. In verses 46 through 52, then Jesus dissects the legalism of the scribes. Well, I think that's true. I don't know that the passage was written just to let us know that there are two different groups. You could have said that in just writing about the scribes and Pharisees. As soon as you said these scribes and the Pharisees, you've let us know you're talking about two groups. The one problem that you would see in the King James Bible with that interpretation is, if you just read very quickly, maybe you can while I'm talking, 44 through 46, if you'd read very quickly, very briefly, but carefully enough, verses 44 through 46, it would seem to contradict this division of this section of Luke 11. It would seem also to contradict some things I've said earlier about the scribes. Well, we're in no hurry. I don't see the millennium starting tomorrow anyway, so I'll go ahead and read some of those verses. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, verse 44. For ye are as graves which appear not, The men that walk over them are not aware of them. What a testimony. I mean, that speaks of deception. That is a verse on deception. Yours graves which appear not. I mean, no one knows they're walking over a grave unless there's a big old mausoleum camped out on top of it or something. You don't know you're walking over. It's underneath the ground. In other words, it's beyond physical, visible evidence. Then answered one of the lawyers and said unto him, Teacher, thus saying, thou reproachest us also. And he said, you got that right. Woe unto you also, lawyers. All right, I don't have to read any more. What's the problem? I'm going to chastise you if you don't tell me what the problem is. There'd be a contradiction according to what we've said thus far about the scribes. All right, look at verse 44. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. He got unto them. And so then in verse 45, then the lawyers are saying, well, now wait a minute. You're talking to us too, aren't you? Well, if he just mentioned them by name in verse 44. All right, the better manuscripts don't have in verse 44 that phrase, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You see, you have to strike that out, because I've already given you proof after proof after proof. The whole New Testament proves that scribes equal lawyers and lawyers equal scribes. If that's true, and it is, then verses 44 through 46 would be a contradiction. It'd be double talk and nonsense, and it'd contradict the rest of the New Testament. So in verse 44, in your King James Bible, you'd want to strike out this phrase, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. That's not in the better manuscripts. Here's one of those few places where you wouldn't have to know what the manuscripts say. What you know about the rest of the New Testament would tell you something's wrong here. There's no way he could be addressing the scribes in verse 44 and then in verse 45 say, well, and the lawyers are saying, well, you're talking to us too. Well, he just mentioned them by name, scribe, in verse 44. Well, no, he didn't. He's not talking to the scribes up to that point. He's talking to the Pharisees. So they certainly have a point here. You've got the most beautiful and the most precise and the best passage in all the Bible to prove there's a distinction between scribes and Pharisees. Because he first of all lays low the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. In verse 38, when the Pharisees saw it, he says in verse 39, now do ye Pharisees. He says in verse 42, woe unto you Pharisees. He says in verse 43, woe unto you Pharisees. He's talking to the Pharisees. Verse 44, he just says, woe unto you. They know who he's talking to. He's already called them by name 3 times now. And at that same gathering, however, are not only Pharisees, but scribes. All right, it proves there are different groups then. The scribes are called lawyers in verse 45. Then answered one of the lawyers and said unto him, Teacher, thus saying, thou reproachest us also. All right, what does that prove? Though there is a distinction, there is a relationship also. The scribes saw that although we're not the Pharisees, for you to criticize the Pharisees is for you to criticize us. So this is the best passage that we could use for this matter. It shows that there is a distinction. It shows that there is a relationship at the same time. It shows that there are differences. It shows that there are similarities. He's criticizing not the scribes, not the lawyers, the Pharisees. But the lawyers know enough about them and their connection to the Pharisees to say, well, in saying that against them, you've reproached us also. And he said, you've interpreted that correctly. Here's one of the places where their interpretation of his teaching is right. In verse 46, when he says, woe unto you also lawyers, he essentially is saying that interpretation of my criticism is correct. I was not only talking to the Pharisees, I was talking to you as well, because there must be some similarities. And then all you have to do is jump down to verse 53. And we have a verse we've looked at earlier that proves those lawyers are the scribes. And as he said these things unto them, these scribes and Pharisees. Reversed order, because the scribes were the ones most recently addressed in verses 46 through 52. Now, I trust you got all that. I just want to say a few things that some of the other scholars say, and I don't think it's necessarily true. Some of them claim that verse 43 in this chapter, verse 43, is wrong, or at least misplaced, that should have been an address to the lawyers. 43 should be somewhere down in 46 to 52. Now, things like that are possible if you could find some manuscript evidence that it just got misplaced somewhere in textual tradition. You say, why do they just pick verse 43 out and say that should be down in addressing the lawyers and not the Pharisees? Well, they say that because they claim elsewhere those criticisms in verse 43 are used against the scribes, such as in Luke, same book, chapter 20 and verse 46. The criticisms of loving the uppermost seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets. That's a criticism of the scribes in chapter 20 and verse 46. That's a criticism of the scribes in Mark 12, verses 38 and 39. But I think 45 would solve the issue, verse 45 for us. Whatever could be leveled against the Pharisees concerning hypocrisy could also be leveled against the scribes concerning hypocrisy. And whatever could be leveled against the scribes concerning legalism could also be leveled against the Pharisees concerning legalism. And there's no textual support for that. You can't say, well, another manuscripts, all of them have it right there. So I see that verse 43 as a criticism of the Pharisees. Elsewhere in Luke 20:46, the same criticism of loving the uppermost seats and greetings in the markets is addressed to the lawyers or to the scribes. And then if you'll turn over to the Sermon on the Mount, this is the other passage of Scripture in Matthew's edition of it, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, that some of these scholars use. In Matthew chapter 5, if you notice verse 20, Matthew 5 and verse 20, I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, here is their interpretation, and I'm not going to say that it's wrong. I just would say there's probably not any way you can prove it or disprove it. It's a theory, and it makes a lot of sense, and I can see some support for it, but I don't know that there'd be any way to prove it or disprove it. So that's the only way I would be able to give it to you. We know that these first 20 verses or so are kind of introduction. Then he's going to really start getting into some specific issues in verse 21. Verse 21, he deals with, anger and murder. Then he goes to adultery and lust. Then he goes to divorce and remarriage. And then he goes to taking the oath and so forth. And then we get past that on into chapter 6. Some scholars see verse 20 in Matthew 5 as sort of like an introduction to the rest of chapter 5, what we have. Now, he didn't speak in chapters. This was just one sermon of his. But they see it as an introduction to the rest of chapter 5, as well as the first 18 verses of chapter 6. I want to show you how they come out with that, or how they came across with that, and it makes a lot of sense. Some have said that it's very, very likely. All right, in verse 20, he addresses the scribes first. Now, what did I say, and what did we see back in Luke 11, but that he criticized the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. He criticized the scribes for their legalism. All right, the order is reversed here in Matthew. Scribes comes first, followed by Pharisees. They say that Matthew 5:21 through Matthew 5:48, the end of the chapter, is his criticism of the scribes. Because those are the verses that speak of, ways of understanding the Old Testament laws. We read like in verse 21, ye have heard that it was said to them of old time. And it's always, ye have heard that it was said, ye have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. Well, we would know the scribes would be the ones concerned with what the ancients had to say about legal matters. Verse 21, you've heard that it was said to them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment, and so forth. We've said before, in coming back to this passage that we did a whole series on years ago, but in coming back to it in a tape in Christian Ethics, I believe, that the background certainly is, and that was what was also implied when we did the whole series. The background certainly is the misinterpretation of the Old Testament. One of the ways to prove that is over in chapter 5 and verse 43. You don't find that anywhere in the Old Testament. Ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. I mean, you can never find a quotation of that. You can never find that verse anywhere in the Old Testament. That is a perversion of the Old Testament's teaching by who? The legal experts. Well, the scribes, or at least those who came before the scribes, their forefathers. So is this making any sense to you? Are you aware of 21 to 40? It's always ye have heard that it hath been said, and you go through a technical list of, well, what constitutes divorce, remarriage? What constitutes adultery? Is it just in the flesh, or can it be in the mind, the subject of lust and all of that? Well, it makes a lot of sense that he's addressing the scribes and their, quote, righteousness. You see in verse 20, unquote, their righteousness, their legalism. Then if you turn over to chapter 6, verses 1 to 18, you've got 3 acts of righteousness. You've got giving, then you have praying, followed by fasting. Matthew 6, 1 to 18 then would speak against the hypocritical religious works and practices of the Pharisees, which goes back to Matthew 5:20. Now that's very likely because we see that term hypocrite throughout the first 18 verses. And that's exactly what, in other places, Jesus calls the Pharisees, you hypocrites. We saw it over in chapter 11 of Luke's Gospel. And that's exactly the term that's appearing here, like in verse 16, moreover, when you fast, be not as the hypocrites. And was he just talking about hypocrites in general, as the hypocrites? Who are the hypocrites? The Pharisees. So that's the theory of some people, that the end of Matthew 5 concerns problems Jesus had with the scribes and their religious life, and the first half of Matthew 6 would concern the Pharisees. That makes a lot of sense to me, but I don't guess it matters one way or the other as long as we understand the spiritual principles we could draw from that. All right, so in all of these places we've seen that the two groups are distinguished. The scribes and the Pharisees are distinguished. However, in other places, they are seen to be the same. Now we're going to get into that for a moment or two. Matthew 22, 34 and 35. So many places there seem to be different, distinct groups. In some places there seem to be not the same, but related. We've already seen that in the implication of Luke 11:45. When the Pharisees, I'm in Matthew 22:34, when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer. All right, that means lawyers, scribes, could belong to the party of the Pharisees. Now that brings up an interesting question concerning the scribes of the Sadducees. Were there any? Was there any such thing? Well, there's not a lot of proof for any existence of the scribes of the Sadducees, that the Sadducees had any leaders of their own, not followers, leaders of their own called scribes. And I don't think there's a lot of reason anyway for there to be proof of that or that to have existed. The scribes and the Pharisees just naturally fit together. The Pharisees are very concerned with the observance of the Old Testament law, and that's just the area where the scribes are experts. The Sadducees aren't concerned in that matter. They're not concerned in some legalistic keeping of the law or legalistic maintaining of oral laws or oral traditions. The very thing that the Pharisees are interested in doing is what we find the scribes experts in laying laws down about. So I think the Pharisees, being the disciples of the scribes, is kind of a natural outworking of both of their reasons for existence. The Sadducees are on the scene for another reason entirely. As a result, they don't have anyone that they look up to unless the ones they look up to happen to be those currently in control of government, the political heathen government in the land of Palestine. But to go on, there are a few places, like in Luke 14:1, where we see the similarity. We see the relationship between these two groups, the scribes and the Pharisees. Luke 14:1. Depending on the context of the New Testament, a Pharisee could mean more specifically a scribe, or vice versa. Depending on the context in the New Testament, a Pharisee could mean specifically a scribe, and vice versa. I'll show you a few places where this would be true. In other words, it's not like we've got 20 people. 10 of them are scribes, and 10 of them are Pharisees. We may have 20 people, or however many. We've got several thousand, of course, we know. Some of them could and would be scribes and Pharisees at the same time. You could certainly be a member of both of the groups. Being a member of one group doesn't necessarily exclude you from being a member of another, or the other. Luke 14:1 may well be one of those situations. It came to pass as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees. Well, I don't know what a chief Pharisee would be unless it was a scribe. There weren't higher Pharisees and lower Pharisees as just Pharisees. There were Pharisees, and then they had people over them who gave them the laws to follow. And who were those people? The scribes. So probably this chief Pharisee, that's just another way of saying scribe. You say, well, why didn't he call him a scribe? All right, that's easy to answer. If you call him a scribe here, you're not telling us that this man belonged to the religious party known as the Pharisees. You're going to have to say something about the Pharisees, or we don't know that he belongs to that party. In other words, the scribes existed sometimes alone, not a part of any religious party, not the Pharisees, not the Essenes, not the Sadducees, not anyone. They were just themselves. They didn't join a certain party. If you want us to know that this scribe was not only that, but also he affiliated with a certain religious group, namely the Pharisees, he wouldn't be affiliating with others, then you're going to have to let us know. So I think this is probably just a natural way of referring to a scribe who had also joined the party of the Pharisees. And so Luke calls him a chief Pharisee, or one of the chief Pharisees. That's the only time I know that it appears in the New Testament. All right, another way we can prove that is this. Paul was a Pharisee, was he not? All right, here's some verses. Philippians 3:5, he was a Pharisee. Acts 26:5, he was a Pharisee. Acts 23:6, he was a Pharisee. What was the party of the Pharisees? It was the strictest form of Judaism. We saw that before in Acts, the book of Acts. It was the strictest form of Judaism, Acts 26 and verse 5. If they would testify, Paul says, that after the most straightest sect of our religion, that is the Pharisees, I live. So Paul was a Pharisee. All right, we know that. But the fact that he had the power of a judge, according to Acts 26:10, and you're going to need to turn to this one and look, makes it almost certain in my mind that Paul was also a scribe. So we've got to join several things together to prove this. I'm talking about Paul in his past life. We know that he was a Pharisee according to specific claims of his, like in Philippians 3 and two places in Acts. But the fact that, according to Acts 26:10, he had the power of judicial decisions. In other words, he had the power to pronounce innocent or guilty. Makes it almost certain in my mind that the man Saul was also a scribe. And common sense and just kind of a general feel for the New Testament, I think, would lead me in that direction anyway. He had a profound knowledge of the Old Testament. And Pharisees didn't necessarily have that. I would say in general Pharisees didn't have that. They didn't have the time. The ones who had the deep knowledge, somewhat twisted on too many occasions, but the deep knowledge of the Old Testament were their leaders, their theologians, the scribes. Paul, in his ability to understand the Old Testament and just the role he played both before his conversion and after his conversion, would seem to point to the fact he was more than just a Pharisee. He wasn't just somebody's little servant boy running around. He wasn't just a religious slave. He was a member of that party because that was the strictest party in Israel, the Pharisees. They wanted to keep every jot and tittle, straining out in a gnat if they could. Don't tell them they swallowed the camel. They would want to hear that, but strain out a gnat, they'd probably agree with you. That's right. That's exactly what we did. Matthew 23. Jesus said, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. But in Acts 26:10 we read, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest. Now that just means from the Sanhedrin. No one could operate just, unless you're a John the Baptist and want your head cut off, separate from the Sanhedrin. And look at this end. When they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. When they were put to death, like Stephen, when they were put to death, I gave a voice. That means I gave my decision against them. He probably had to be a scribe. And there we would call him not a scribe, but a what? A lawyer. There, that emphasizes the legal aspect of the fact that you are capable of being a judge and handing out decisions and handing out sentences as well. So I think that Paul was, or Saul in his pre-conversion days was a Pharisee, he was a scribe, he was a lawyer. He had all the training. He was brought up at Gamaliel's feet. We've got all these other references we could turn to. He's got all this training, all of this knowledge. He'd been brought up in Jerusalem. He wasn't born there. He was born somewhere else, and his parents sent him to Jerusalem so he could get all of this training. That's going to make you more than a Pharisee. You're going to be way higher than the Pharisees. Although they're a strict religious sect, and since you're so strict in your desire to obey the Old Testament law, you're going to want to be a Pharisee. But he's going to be more than that. He's going to be a scribe and a lawyer. And then one other section or passage or two that we could turn to would be along this line. When we see Jesus talking to the Pharisees about technical theological matters, I think we should understand those Pharisees as being not just Pharisees, but scribes and lawyers, however you want to call them. For instance, Matthew 19, 1-9. Now this would just be a little more light that you might not have known or thought of on your own. Matthew 19, 1-9. Let me say that again. Whenever we see Jesus talking with what the text calls Pharisees over technical, theological, and exegetical and legal questions, we probably should understand them to be scribes. Now, it's possible that they're not scribes and they're just Pharisees and they're just so zealous for what they've learned and they don't know much of what they've learned. But it may be more likely that we have scribes on our hands. Verse 3 in Matthew 19, the Pharisees, so they'd let us know that if my view is, or my suggestion to you is right, that these are scribes, they were part of the Pharisaic party. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? This was a great question between the disciples of the more conservative and the more liberal schools of Hillel and Shammai in the 1st century A.D. And he gives them the reference to the beginning, the way it was in the beginning. But they said to him in verse 7, well, then why did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? You know a little bit about this issue. It's a rather complicated issue. Most normal lay Christians, it's too difficult to deal with. Maybe for the Pharisees, it was too difficult to deal with. The scribes, they would have their opinions. They would have their understanding of Deuteronomy 24 and what that issue of uncleanness is, and the creation account and all the other accounts in the Old Testament. They got to have some understanding of that. So perhaps we are to understand them behind it. Also in Matthew 22, verses 34 through 46. Matthew 22, 34 through 46. We're even told this was a lawyer that asked him the question, but he came from the party of the Pharisees. But it's a technical question concerning the relative weight of various Old Testament laws. He wants to know which one weighs the most. And then in verse 41, when the Pharisees gathered together, Jesus said, "What think ye of Christ?" That is, not me, but, Christ as he's predicted in the Old Testament. "What think ye of him? Whose son is he?" They say unto him, "The son of David." He saith unto them, "How then doth David in spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit thou on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool? If David called him Lord, how is he his son?" And no man was able to answer him a word. Neither durst any man from that day forth ask him any more questions. He probably cornered those sharp-shooting scribes in that case there. He even caught them. It's easy to catch the Pharisees. They wouldn't be as knowledgeable as the scribes. It's like when you catch a disciple of some leader. It's easier to catch a disciple than it is the leader. The leader knows more. The theologian knows more than the one that's following him. So it's good whenever the theologians don't ask you any more questions from that day forth. All right, let me sum up tonight's teaching with this short paragraph. There was one group of rigidly Orthodox Jews. It was made up of untrained lay members called Pharisees and ordained scholars and theologians called Scribes. It's really one group. It doesn't mean that every Pharisee was a scribe or vice versa, but it's one group of people who are very concerned about obeying the law. Now, to them, sometimes their own law, it was so confused in their mind, they saw their law as being God's law. And Jesus criticized them for that. There's one group of rigidly Orthodox Jews. It's made up of two parts. Part A, untrained, unschooled, non-ordained lay members, called the Pharisees. Part B, ordained theologians and Old Testament scholars, called the Scribes.